Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and welcome to Fully Equipped. For the next couple of chapters, we'll be reading about Paul's second missionary journey. This time, he's parted ways with Barnabas and teamed up with Silas to go and visit the places where he had preached on his first missionary journey. In chapter 16, Paul follows the Holy Spirit's leading around the whole region of Asia Minor. We also read about his call to Macedonia and his ministry there. They spend some time in prison, but God is growing his church. Remember the city of Lystra from chapter 14? This is the city where the people thought that Paul and Barnabas were Greek gods, and the Jews stoned Paul. This time, Paul comes across a disciple named Timothy. It's possible that Timothy had come to faith when Paul had come through on his first missionary journey, but we don't know. Timothy becomes a prominent person in the New Testament. The two letters, 1 and 2 Timothy, were both written by Paul to this Timothy. So Timothy is the son of a Jew and a Gentile. That's why Paul has him circumcised, even though they've just decided that Gentiles don't need to be circumcised in the church. Paul's not contradicting his own beliefs. He just recognizes that the unbelieving Jews won't accept anything that Timothy or Paul say if he's not seeming to be following Jewish law. In those times, Jews saw uncircumcised sons of Jewish mothers as violating the Old Covenant, and kind of like traitors. So Paul circumcises Timothy not for salvation, but so that others will be open to receive salvation. And Paul continues to preach in the churches the decision that had been made by the Jerusalem Council. And so the church continues to grow in strength and in numbers. After this, we read about how Paul is guided by the Holy Spirit to go to Macedonia, which was a province of Greece near Italy. Luke writes that the Holy Spirit had forbidden them to speak the word in Asia. Asia in the New Testament is not the continent we know today. It's actually just the region of modern-day Turkey. It's also known as Asia Minor. They must have really known that it was the Holy Spirit guiding them, because the journey they went on to the city of Troas was about 650 kilometers on foot. Whilst they're at Troas, Paul receives a vision of a man from Macedonia, and this man is calling Paul to come to his country and help them. Paul recognizes that this vision is from God, so they decide that they have to go to Macedonia. Notice how Luke writes that we sought to go on to Macedonia. This suggests that Luke was actually part of the group of missionaries traveling there. So we know that a lot of this story is actually an eyewitness account. And so the gospel is about to go to Europe. The group set sail and they end up in Philippi, a city of Macedonia. This city is where the rest of Acts 16 will take place. We'll learn more about this city when we get to the book of Philippians. The first thing that they do here is to witness to a group of women who are gathered together. It doesn't seem like there's a big Jewish presence in Philippi, because there doesn't seem to be a synagogue there. But there are some people who worship God, who possibly weren't Jews. One of these people is Lydia. She was likely a wealthy woman because she sold purple goods, things like purple dye and fabrics. During this time in the Roman Empire, the law meant that only the very wealthy and high status could wear the color purple. So Lydia's customers would have made her quite rich. God is at work in Lydia's heart. He opens her heart to receive the gospel and the words that Paul gives her. That's why when we go about evangelism or sharing our testimonies or living in a way that displays God, we have to remember that God is sovereign. We can't say something super wise that will convince someone to believe in Jesus. And we can't debate someone into knowing him. We have to be faithful to speak the truth. But ultimately, it's God who does the real heart work necessary for salvation. When someone is saved, it's because God was moving in their hearts, not because we are super intelligent and said all the right things. So there's an element of conveying the information about the gospel and sharing our experiences with Jesus in a way that allows people to receive it. But ultimately, we have to pray and trust in God to move. And God does that. He moves in Lydia's heart and she receives the gospel. She and her whole household, probably including servants, were all baptized and put their faith in Jesus. And the text also indicates that Lydia's house became the place where the Christians would gather. The next story describes how Paul casts a demon out of a slave girl and how him and Silas are both thrown into prison. This slave girl had been possessed by a demon that allowed her to predict the future and tell fortunes. Her owners would use this to make a profit from her. This girl is following Paul and the other missionaries around as they go about their ministry, and she continues to do so for days. She's crying out that the men are servants of God and proclaim the way of salvation. Why would a demon announce this? And why does Paul get annoyed at this if it's the truth? And why does Paul not cast the demon out immediately? These are all good questions for us to think about. It's interesting that demons often seem to proclaim truthful things throughout the New Testament. Like how when Jesus interacted with demon-possessed people, they would often acknowledge him as the Son of God. We don't really have a definitive answer as to why the demon in this girl announces this. But it's possible that it's trying to make them look bad and distract from the message that they are bringing. Paul probably doesn't want his ministry associated with this demon. Perhaps he didn't feel led to cast the demon out straight away. But in the end, God still gets the glory. The girl is delivered. We don't know whether or not she accepted Jesus after that, but it's probable. However, the slave girl's owners are not happy with her deliverance. Now they've lost their way of profiting. So they have them dragged before the magistrate, accusing them of disturbing the city. There's no justice here. There's no fair trial. They don't get to defend themselves. Instead, Paul and Silas are beaten and thrown into prison. The last story of this chapter provides some hope and joy, though. We read about how Paul and Silas spend their time in prison singing and praying and worshipping God. Notice how many times throughout Acts, the believers rejoice in the face of suffering. They actually see suffering for the gospel as an honor. They don't spend their time in prison complaining or plotting revenge. They spend it worshipping and seeking God. And as they're worshipping, there's a big earthquake that shakes the prison. The doors miraculously open so that all of the prisoners will be able to escape. Remember how we talked about how Roman guards would be killed if their prisoners escaped? When a jailer sees that all of the prison doors are open, he actually goes to take his own life, knowing the fate that will come for him as the guard. But Paul stops him, saying that all of the prisoners are still present and none have escaped. The jailer recognizes that God is with Paul, and he wants what Paul's got. The jailer has seen God's power on display through the earthquake and the broken chains, but he's also seen it through Paul and Silas being loving towards him, though he's abused them. He humbly asks Paul and Silas what he must do to be saved, and they tell him to believe in Jesus, and then his whole household will be saved. It's important to note that Paul is not saying that his individual salvation will bring salvation to his whole family. Each person within the household would still have to personally put their trust in God, and they do so. All of them are baptized and put their faith in Jesus and are filled with deep spiritual joy. At the end of this chapter, we see Paul and Silas are released from prison. The morning after the earthquake, the magistrates try to have them secretly freed. We don't really know why they let the two men go, but Paul isn't happy that they aren't given public vindication. This is important because the church is just starting in Philippi. If the church founder is seen to be someone who is a criminal causing trouble in the city, then it's not a good look for the gospel or the new church. So that's why Paul's insisting that they are publicly freed. He wants people to see that Christianity is not rising up against the Roman Empire, and they are not a cult causing problems. Also, for some context, Paul brings up that they are Roman citizens. This is something that comes up a couple of times in the New Testament. Under Roman law, Anybody who was a citizen of Rome could not be beaten or imprisoned without getting a formal hearing, which Paul and Silas were not given. So that's why Paul makes his complaint. He's not seeking personal revenge or trying to get a good reputation. He cares about the reputation of God and the gospel. All of this is so that the church can grow. So how does this equip us? There will be many situations in our lives where we are wronged, where someone does something against us that is unfair and unjust. Many people suffer because of the choices that other people make. It's pretty much guaranteed that at some point in your life, someone will mistreat you. How do we respond in situations like this? Paul and Silas were beaten and mocked. Being Roman citizens, it was even more unfair for them to go through what they did. But their reaction to this reveals a lot about their hearts and their relationship with God. They're worshipping and filled with the joy of the Lord despite what they're going through. This highlights that our joy and peace and attitude actually aren't dependent upon our circumstances. As believers, we're promised inexpressible joy at all times. But often, this isn't what we see around us. Believers can be really negative, pessimistic, and cynical people. It's easy to forget that our reactions and responses are an effective way of witnessing to those around us. The jailer wanted to know about Jesus because of the way Paul and Silas responded with peace. They didn't blame God or get angry or take a break from ministry. They knew that God's goodness and faithfulness were not dependent on their circumstances. So let's be people who seek to have a good attitude, cultivate the joy of the Lord in our lives, and trust Him no matter what we face.